big CGI fight coming up.
Colossus and Juggernaut are the two hardest characters in the X-Men universe. We can all agree that when things get tough, be it for the heroes or the villains, these two are the guys who are sent. Even though they share no blood ties, these two characters are almost like two sides of the same coin. Plus, they have a well-documented rivalry between them. Think of the 1984 bar brawl in Uncanny X-Men issue 183. That brawl leveled the entire building, and for years, Colossus kept losing to Juggernaut until the one time he decided to lean into strategy instead of strength. And of course, then we have the big showdown on screen in Deadpool 2. So when I tell you these two guys are related to each other narratively, I mean it. Also, you have to keep in mind that in the recent X-Men comics hitting the shelves, Juggernaut is actually a member of the X-Men, basically doing an enemies to friends plot right in front of our eyes. So you gotta wonder, if the mutant covered in organic steel and a man empowered by a literal demon god both hit like freight trains, then what is actually different underneath? So without further ado, let's list the biggest differences between Colossus's and Juggernaut's powers.
Hey! Pick on someone your own size!
That's such a you thing to say.
Two completely different origin stories. Let's start our list off with the biggest difference between the two, because honestly, everything else on our list kinda builds up from here. Colossus's power is a mutation. Pyotr Rasputin was born with an X gene that allows him to have this psionic link with his own body so that, at a moment's notice, he can turn his skin, muscle, and bone into an organic, near-indestructible metal. It is a bit weird, but it's superhuman biology. It kinda makes sense. But Juggernaut, on the other hand, is a man. Cain Marko, Professor X's stepbrother, doesn't have the X gene in his body. He became Juggernaut simply because he stumbled upon the Crimson Gem of Cyttorak, which is this ancient mystical artifact. This gem is connected to an exiled demon god named Cyttorak, who's all about chaos and whatnot. When Cain picked up this gem, he became the avatar of Cyttorak, and he got its powers through the gem, giving him the super strength we usually associate with him. While Colossus is working with the gift of nature, Cain made a deal, even if he didn't understand it fully. This is important because Cyttorak is a demon god who is immensely destructive. This crimson gem of his is the foothold he has in our reality, and every time Cain becomes the Juggernaut, he is channeling something that is beyond us and beyond our comprehension. Also, since Cain's powers come from Cyttorak, if Cyttorak decides to ditch him as the Juggernaut, then Cain gets depowered. Colossus, on the other hand, never has to deal with that kind of depowerment. You could say that in this video, we're actually comparing a mutation against mystical empowerment instead of just two guys, because the origins of the powers themselves already change the dynamics. The power Pyotr can switch off and the one Cain can't. As I said before, Pyotr cannot turn his power on and off at will. He can decide when he wants to be armored up, and there's a little inbuilt failsafe in there. If he ever gets knocked unconscious while he's in his steel form, his body automatically reverts to his human state so that his friends can actually help him. That's why over the years, we've seen Colossus existing as just Pyotr, teaching art, mentoring students, and having a normal life. Because deep down, he's always been a family guy. He wants the normalcy of an everyday man. And thanks to his powers, he can, to a certain extent, get to experience that at will. Cain sadly doesn't have the same luxury. His connection to Cyttorak is always there. Being Juggernaut is like a second identity to him. It's bonded to him, and Cain can't run away from it. That's why in several storylines, we actually see Cain trying to run away from it. He's tried to negotiate with it, figure out who he is without it, and whatnot. He has been at it for decades, struggling to accept the idea that being the Juggernaut might just be who he is now, whether he likes it or not, which has led to him wondering out loud if the gift from Cyttorak was even a gift at all. Kane's power makes him unstoppable, yes, but it also takes away the chances he has at a normal life and identity that he craves. What does unstoppable mean for both of them? Both of these guys are often described by fans as unstoppable. While I get where everyone's coming from, the word doesn't mean the same thing for either of them. Because, okay, Juggernaut functions based on mystical mechanics. Once he builds up momentum, the laws of physics stop applying to him in the way they do for us. So the best way to stop Juggernaut has always been to simply get out of his way before he gets moving. Because the more he moves, the more powerful he becomes. If you try to plant your feet and take the hit, you won't be stopping him. Instead, you'll just become part of the wreckage. Colossus, on the other hand, is unstoppable in the more conventional way. He is enormous with superhuman strength. So when he starts running at you, as the normal laws of physics dictate, you are screwed. He can bulldoze through most things standing in his way because of physics. But nothing he can do grants him powers the way Sidorak's blessings guarantee them for Kane. So you could say Kane can't be stopped by literal definition, while Colossus is just extremely, extremely hard to stop. But if you can stand in front of either of them, that little difference wouldn't matter at all. Armor skin versus an actual force field. You know what else both of these guys are famous for? How hard it is to hurt them. Colossus's durability is a physical thing. The dense organic steel layer that covers his body, skin, and even eyes is often compared to osmium. Osmium happens to be one of the densest naturally occurring metals that exists. It can take an absolute pounding and still manage to hold itself together. Juggernaut, on the other hand, has something extra on top of his physical toughness. Because he is the avatar of Sidorak, his champion, the demon god bestowed him with this mystical force field around him. This force field protects his body from most things thrown his way. That's why Juggernaut was able to walk away from a direct hit from Thor's hammer. And even if you were able to somehow pierce through the force field, you probably wouldn't be able to hurt him anyway because, again, Sidorak has already buffed out his health stats. The force field just happens to be the first line of defense for Kane. Speaking of defenses, there is also a stark difference in how each of these defenses holds up over the course of a long fight. Colossus's armor is part of his physical body, while Juggernaut's force field is a continuously generated mystical effect. Even the two strongmen aren't the same size. Before I start throwing numbers at you, I have to warn you guys about something. Comic book character heights and weights, the stats I mean, are notoriously inconsistent depending on who the writer is, the era, and honestly, whoever's drawing that particular issue. So whatever numbers I'm going to give you, even though they are from the official websites and whatnot, they are at best rough ballparks. Now let's talk numbers. So Juggernaut has been consistently described as being in the 9 to 10 foot range and somewhere around a ton once he's fully armored up. Yeah, you heard that right. He weighs nearly a ton. Colossus, on the other hand, even though he's huge by human standards, is actually still shorter than Kane. He's around 7 to 8 feet tall. And even in his armored form, he is nowhere near Juggernaut's weight class. Juggernaut is just operating on a whole different physical scale. This mass of his also plays a big role in his attacks because more mass moving at speed means more force behind every hit. That's why Juggernaut's charges are treated as a distinct threat in comparison to, like, a punch from Colossus. That's why whenever you see panels of Juggernaut and Colossus side by side, you'll see Juggernaut looming over Colossus's shoulder, which is really the art department hammering home the message that Juggernaut is a threat. The speed gap nobody talks about. We've talked about who is bigger and who hits harder, so now we'll talk about who is faster. It's a shame that most of the time this is not talked about that much because the gap between the two characters is absolutely vast. Juggernaut, once he gets moving, can push at speeds of roughly 600 miles per hour. This is part of that mystical momentum that we're talking about that makes him so hard to stop in the first place. And at those high speeds, once Kane builds up steam, the window the heroes have to react is barely there. That's why jumping out of the way works best. Colossus, on the other hand, despite being a metal man, is nowhere near the supersonic level. He is fast, but when compared to Juggernaut, he's pretty slow. With that in mind, you have to understand just how the math on collateral damage changes. Because a slower, heavier hit is more localized. You know roughly where the damage is going to happen. But if the charge is at 30+ times highway speed, then chances are the entire street will be turned into a blast zone. Only one of them can fight without rest. Because of the mystical source of his powers, Juggernaut's body doesn't have the same limitations that we do. He doesn't need food, water, sleep, oxygen, or even rest because he genuinely doesn't feel any of that. His stamina is endless thanks to Sidorak. So you know the usual things you count on when you're facing a bigger opponent? The whole, okay, let the fight draw out, they'll certainly make a mistake out of exhaustion, or maybe the opponent will get tired and pass out? Yeah, none of those work for Juggernaut. The teams that have gone up against Juggernaut in extended engagements have had to build their entire plans around a decisive strike to stop him rather than letting it all play out, because that would never work with him. Colossus, in comparison, has a threshold. He is a strong guy for sure, but underneath that metal, there is a human body with pretty human limits. They may be bigger than yours or mine, but they are there. So he's someone who can genuinely be knocked unconscious in a fight or pushed past his limit until he can't keep going anymore. Juggernaut can also be knocked unconscious or incapacitated, but simply exhausting him is not a reliable way to do it. The one weak spot hiding under Juggernaut's helmet. Now, with all the points I've made so far, you could argue that I'm glazing Juggernaut. But I really am not. He is just really that strong. But even the strongest person has some kind of a weakness, right? And for Juggernaut, it's his mind. He's vulnerable to telepathic attacks. His body, despite being so invincible, can't protect him against that. And that's the entire reason why his signature helmet exists in the first place. That's why we always see heroes and villains alike doing their best to physically rip the helmet off him mid-fight. Professor X has subdued Juggernaut the same way several times because that often works. You know who doesn't have a helmet? Colossus. He has nothing equivalent to that on him. And in a way, you could say that because Colossus doesn't have a familiar kryptonite finish-him move, that makes him the more well-rounded of the two. Because if you want to defeat Colossus, you have to find something that works against him. Kane's kryptonite is always on his person, you just gotta take it off. The time Colossus actually became the Juggernaut. When the Fear Itself event was taking place, Cain Marko touched one of the enchanted hammers of the Asgardian serpent and became the host of Kurth, Breaker of Stone. Magic and Colossus exposed this betrayal to Sidorak, since Cain was still Juggernaut. As a result, Sidorak stripped him of the Juggernaut power and handed it to Pyotr. He actually went on to become one of Sidorak's favorite avatars in centuries, because a hero causing that kind of destruction as a necessary evil fed the demon god in the way a hidden villain could never do. And when Colossus became Juggernaut, he still kept his own organic steel mutation running at the same time. So basically, for a stretch of the comics, he was both at the same time. This arc was also the direct setup for their eventual rematch when Colossus fully understood what exactly he was up against from the inside. This is why we felt that it would be right to compare the two, because this kind of understanding of your opponent has to mean something. This is arguably the single biggest crossover point their power sets ever had. Plus, this arc gave us a very interesting look into Pyotr's psychology because he, as a character, is someone who's all about restraint and control. Then, suddenly, he was in charge of a very destructive force, and he was being told by the god that he was doing a fantastic job at this. One fights like a soldier, the other just walks through walls. I've been reading X-Men since my teen years, and when I first met Juggernaut and Colossus, I really didn't know all of this nitty-gritty about who was what. In my eyes, they were just two big dudes, one with a helmet, the other made of metal, going at it. But even in those days, I noticed a stark difference between the two when it came to their fighting styles. Colossus, who had spent years in the Danger Room, is a genuinely trained tactical fighter. He knows what to do when the situation calls for it, and he knows how to use his mass strategically instead of just swinging it around. Juggernaut, in the meantime, doesn't really care about agility or flexibility. All he cares about is his momentum. He would just go in a straight line until someone gives in, instead of thinking critically mid-fight and using his opponent's strengths against him. This gap in thinking becomes more and more obvious when you look at their fights. Colossus's fights genuinely look like they are choreographed properly. He knows exactly when to shift his weight and land a blow with the most damage. That's why, over the years, you can see Colossus actually improving. We don't get any of that from Juggernaut, which is a shame. Different ways of stopping them. Over the years, writers have come up with some really interesting ways of stopping Juggernaut dead in his tracks because ripping off his helmet, despite being a classic move, was also starting to get kind of boring. Spider-Man once lured Juggernaut into a pit of wet cement before he could build up momentum, basically using his own mass against him. Beating Kane requires you to think and figure out his tricks. Colossus is more like an obstacle. You have to be bigger, better, stronger, or smarter in order to beat him. That's why when you see Juggernaut getting defeated, it's usually at the hands of telepaths or tricksters, basically heroes who would rather let their minds do the talking and not their fists. People who have beaten up Colossus are usually in the same weight class as him, with more raw force at their disposal. A rivalry Colossus spent years losing before he won it. Remember the 1984 bar brawl that we began the video with? That brawl ended with Colossus knocked out underneath the rubble. Since then, Juggernaut usually walked away as the winner when they faced each other, until, well, 2015's Amazing X-Men issue 19. Here, Colossus won by fighting smarter and borrowing some of Wolverine's less than honorable tactics. I also have to mention that in Uncanny X-Men issues 542 to 543, we have a rematch, and here, Juggernaut-empowered Colossus confronted Kane after he had become Kurth, Breaker of Stone. It took Piotr decades of comic book history to settle this score, and this kind of grudge is rare. In most superhero comics, rivalries are either resolved in a single arc or forgotten when a new writer takes over. But for Piotr, writers kept coming back to it over and over again because the whole power dynamic was so imbalanced from the get-go. And once the first clear win happened, the relationship between the two characters changed dramatically. Because now, whenever they face off against one another, no one can tell who will win. The feats fans actually point to. If you ask the fans for the feats that define these guys, you'll definitely get different answers. For Juggernaut, people usually point to the time he fought his way through the Crimson Cosmos and physically knocked out Sidorak after being powered by Gomer and Tar, just to escape. It's an absurd moment, but hey, it shows the ceiling of what he can do when he goes all in. For Colossus, the most cited single moment is when he dropped the villain's Proteus with a single punch. He's also fought against the Hulk and the Shi'ar Imperial Guard, who are no jokes. From the very few examples I've given, you can see that Juggernaut's ceiling reads higher, but it shows up under mystically charged, isolated events. Colossus's adventures, on the other hand, are much more grounded, but in my eyes, a lot more awe-inspiring because he's consistently going up against some of the biggest names in the Marvel Universe. I feel that who impresses you says a lot more about what you value in a fighter than it does about either of those characters. and frankly, I'm kind of okay with that. The two old enemies now wearing the same uniform. Over the last few years, Juggernaut has tried his damnedest to reform, and finally, he is a fully fledged member of the team. He is now an X-Man, showing just how far he's come from his days as one of the team's greatest enemies. It's really interesting that the unstoppable force and immovable object of X-Men lore are now standing on the same side of the larger fight. But this is happening because their rivalry isn't over. It's been folded into something no one could have seen coming. Which brings me to the most important question that every Colossus and Juggernaut fan has been wondering about. What is going to happen when they need to fight? Would it be a big showdown where Colossus and Juggernaut would work together to take down a common enemy? Or would some misunderstanding happen and bring the old rivalry back? Given everything I've told you about them, it really could be a toss-up. This was not going to be an apples-to-apples kind of comparison when no one's really an apple and the other is an orange. Despite the differences, I do believe that they are at the same level, narratively speaking. They have been rivals for years, and now they're both aligned with the X-Men. Colossus has been Juggernaut, so he understands Kane better than almost anyone now, and maybe, just maybe, if a writer plans on executing it, I do see a chance of a beautiful friendship blossoming between the two. They are both unstoppable, both powerhouses, just in different ways. Okay, so let me know in the comments what you think will happen next in the comics and who you would pick between the two to be in your corner. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.